Nighttime. Naruto was sitting on the roof of the Sabaku estate, gazing at the stars and the moon, as had become his habit over the last 6 months of sleeping alone in the alleys on the streets. He felt comfort in the silence and the twinkling of stars and the cool breeze blowing against his face as he sensed someone behind him but knew who it was as a small smile graced his lips. "Hey." Temari softly said, sitting beside him in her usual white battle kimono with a fishnet wrapping on her right thigh and left calf and her headband on her neck as she brought her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. "Hey." He said softly and both sat in comfortable silence gazing at the sky as Temari spoke up. "I heard you made it, congratulations." She whispered and he nodded gratefully with a small smile. "Arigato, I owe you a lot, Temari. I owe you my life." He whispered, staring at the sky, and a small smile graced her features as Naruto turned his head towards her, his eyes glazed with tears, and she gasped as he continued. "I finally belong somewhere. People don't hate me here, they don't throw me out of shops, they don't wish death on me, but I'm a part of the village here. Today I felt like I had someplace to belong and maybe a chance for acceptance, for the first time in my life I was happy." He said through sobs breaking down a bit as Temari brought him close to her and hugged him. She was happy that he had some of his shine returned to his eyes, how much he craved for just being accepted she thought, cursing the Leaf Village inwardly and running her fingers through his golden locks. "SHH everyone will respect you here and I have always accepted you Naruto and I always will." She whispered and he nodded as she wiped away her tears as the smell of something cooking reached their noses and Temari scrunched up her face in disgust. "That idiot Kankuro is making something again, he'll eat it alone. I swear I'll die before I have another bowl of his disgusting miso soup again." She said and Naruto laughed as she leaned her head on his shoulder and scooted closer to avoid the breeze as Naruto wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her closer to him as a rosy pink blush adorned her cheeks and she smiled and melted in him taking in his warmth that blocked the cold breeze. "Don't worry I'll make you something after Kankuro and Gaara are done finishing their dinner alright." He said softly and she smiled and nodded on his shoulder. "Thank you. I love it when you cook, you know." She whispered and he put his head on hers both gazing at the stars smiling. "I know." He whispered back. Both of them entered an hour after Gaara and Kankuro had finished with their dinner and Naruto cooked her up some curry and rice and to her surprise a caramel pudding that she devoured much to his amusement and he gave her his portion too, seeing her happy face as she ate it and sighed contently. Naruto started going back to his room when he saw Temari stop behind him fidgeting and he was confused as she was looking down while fiddling with her kimono. He put a hand on her cheek and brought her face up to meet his eyes as he looked at her concerned about what was wrong. "What's wrong Temari?" he asked and she looked in his eyes looking at her in concern and had a faint blush on her face as she decided to make her embarrassing request. "I kinda wanted to ask you if we could share the same bed. I like it when someone holds me, I haven't had anyone since my mother and have always slept alone. So I was thinking if you wouldn't mind." She stopped as Naruto chuckled softly and she looked at him hurt and averted her eyes, thinking he was making fun of her as a tear rolled down her eye. She had told him her problem and showed him her vulnerable side and now she felt stupid. "Temari look at me." He whispered softly and she didn't meet his eyes as he put his other hand on her cheek, forcing her to look at him as he gave her a small smile. "You didn't even have to ask." He said softly and her eyes widened as she hugged him tightly and he hugged her back, chuckling softly as she punched his chest muttering baka and smiled burying her face in his chest. "Go on and get changed into something comfortable alright." He whispered and she nodded and went to her room to get changed into her t-shirt and some skin-tight shorts that she wore in the nights. Last night had been embarrassing enough to sleep with him in her panties and she was at least going to wear something comfortable and respectable tonight as she opened the door and blushed seeing him in his boxers and t-shirts. Naruto are you going to wear that to sleep?" she asked and he looked at himself confused. "Is something wrong with it?" he asked innocently, honestly not understanding what the problem was. "And no, it's nothing." She said blushing a faint pink blush and he shrugged as both got into the bed and she laid her head on his chest, wrapping her arms around his waist as he pulled her closer and took in the scent of her hair. She smelled like desert lilies he mused and both cuddled up as Temari sighed in satisfaction. Naruto was glad too since the last 2 nights he had slept with her, there were no nightmares to haunt him and he had slept peacefully as both of their eyes drooped heavily and Temari yawned cutely. "Good night Naruto." She whispered softly. "Good night Temari." He whispered back and both fell into a deep slumber, the peaceful silence of the night and the cool breeze coming through the window, claiming them as both slept enjoying each other's warmth. Sonagakur no Sato. Next morning. Temari woke up to see the peacefully sleeping face of the whiskered blonde on her side, cuddled up to her and smiled as she buried her face in the crook of his neck and he held her tightly closer to him and she felt so safe in his arms. And Kuro was gone for a patrolling mission early this morning, and Gaara always left early so she could sleep in as she closed her eyes and snuggled into him. She was suddenly woken up by a knock to the door of the estate as she growled and got out of bed, and Naruto woke up rubbing his eyes and yawning. She got to the main door and opened it up in an annoyed manner when she saw Lady Chiyo standing there. "Lady Chiyo, this is a surprise, is there something wrong?" She asked politely and Lady Chiyo smiled, waving her off. No, Temari Haim. I just wanted to see this news that I heard about yesterday at the council. Naruto Uzumaki was his name if I remember right. She said and Temari looked at her surprised. She had thought of many reasons for her visit, but this surely wasn't one on her list she thought. What do you want with Naruto Lady Chiyo? She asked politely and held a cautious tone to it and Lady Chiyo chuckled slightly, confusing her. And we go in and talk about it, my old legs get tired very easily now you know. She said playfully while Temari blushed in embarrassment. Of course, where are my manners please come in. She said politely ushering her in and picked up her headband from the drawer in the living room table and tied up her hair in a high ponytail as she offered Chiyo a seat. She sat there with a smile. I'll go and get Naruto. She said and Chiyo nodded and smiled sitting there as she went upstairs to go get Naruto. She entered the room to see Naruto come out wiping his face with a towel and smiled at her. Who was it, Temari? He asked softly and she gave him a smile. It's Lady Chiyo, she is one of the 2 honorable elders of the village and is highly respected. She wants to meet you. She said and Naruto tilted his head to the side in confusion. Me, what for? He asked in a confused voice and she shrugged. Lady Chiyo is a strange woman, she will only talk to you about what she wants. Let's go. She said pulling her with him by the hand and Naruto just followed her and sat on the armchair to see a pretty old lady looking at him surprised at first and then with fondness and he grew even more confused. I'm sorry Lady Chiyo, but I don't really know you so may I ask what you wish to see me for? He asked and she smiled at him picking up a biscuit on the table as she spoke. Straight to the point and not wasting any time just like an Uzumaki. She said cryptically and Naruto grew uncomfortable hearing this. Temari saw his uneasiness and herself grew confused by what she said. Naruto got up to leave the room and calm himself down. I'll go make us some tea. I'll be right back. He said but was cut off as Chiyo spoke up, cutting him off. I had my suspicions, but you really are his son, the same hair, the same eyes and her face. Now I have cleared all my doubts. She said as Naruto stopped dead in his tracks and Temari grew scared as she saw a dangerous glint in his eyes. I don't understand what you mean. He said in an all too calm tone, but Temari sensed a low warning tone in it and glanced at Chiyo whose smile was getting wider by the minute. Please you know absolutely what I mean Naruto-kun, don't play dumb with me. She said happily as Naruto calmed himself down and went through hand seals and put his palm on the ground as seals covered the room and then disappeared. Privacy seals and of such high level with only hand seals, you are a true Uzumaki indeed. She said happily as Naruto turned his full gaze at her and Temari grew uncomfortable at the situation that was unfolding. Who told you? He said in a tone that meant business and Temari turned to Chiyo who had her usual smile on her face and motioned for Naruto to sit down and he did so hesitantly beside Temari who was looking at him with worried eyes. Naruto what's going on? She asked in a soft and worried tone and he sighed and sat down beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulder, bringing her close as she leaned in and put her head on his shoulder and he sighed knowing he had to tell her now, though he wanted to wait a few days to tell her. Is it right to tell her Naruto-kun? Chiyo asked and Naruto glanced sharply at her and she flinched back. Do not wish to tell me who I could and could not trust. It is my secret to tell and I do not mean any disrespect, but it is my decision. He said calmly and she nodded with a smile. Temari, she's talking about my parents. She knew them. He said and she turned to him with curious eyes. You never told me about them after that night I asked about that letter. She said and he nodded with a smile. But how does she know them and who are they? She asked and he turned a glance to the smiling Chiyo. But I wish to know as well. He said and her smile dropped as she spoke up. I met them during the ending of the Third Great Shinobi War. They were great people, the only ones I respected from the leaf after the events of the Second Great Shinobi War. Your mother was a great Naruto-kun and a good friend of mine. She had the fiery red Uzumaki hair and the temper to go with it that only your father could handle. Your father though I didn't know him closely was one of the most honorable people I met and I respected him a lot. Both were the last of their clans and when I heard the name Uzumaki and that you were in the village I had to meet their son. Not many remember their clan since they were almost extinct after the Second Great Shinobi War. She said fondly and Naruto smiled as Temari put a hand on his cheek turning his face towards her. Naruto, who were they? She asked softly and Naruto put a hand over hers and sighed. Their names were Kushina Uzumaki, the princess of the Uzumaki clan and the heiress to Uzashigakure. My father he was. He choked a bit as she rubbed his cheek and looked at him warmly. Who was he, Naruto? She asked and a tear dropped from his eye. Minato Namikaze. He whispered and she thought for a bit. She had heard that name before, but where? Then realization came across her face and her eyes widened. The yellow flash, the Yondaime Hokage Minato Namikaze. She asked in disbelief, and he nodded. And he, she said solemnly and he nodded as tears streamed down his eyes and she hugged him bringing him to her chest. Oh, I'm so sorry, Naruto. She whispered, running her fingers through his hair as he sobbed in chest and she put her chin on his head, cooing at him. I'm sorry, Naruto-kun. I didn't want to bring back bad memories, I just came to see her son. Chiyo said in an apologetic voice and he shook his head wiping his eyes. Don't be, I'm glad that I met someone who knew them personally, if you don't mind can you tell me something about them? He asked hopefully and she nodded with a smile. Of course Naruto-kun, today I have a council meeting unfortunately, but hopefully tomorrow you can come to my house. Temari-hime knows where it is. She said and he nodded gratefully. That would be very nice, Lady Chiyo. I am really grateful. He said and she nodded and turned to leave and Temari and Naruto walked back to the living room and sat down on the couch in silence as Temari broke it. Naruto, does Gaara know? She asked and he nodded and she looked down. Then why didn't you tell me, Naruto, don't you trust me? She whispered and he immediately sat by her side pulling her in a hug. No, Temari, don't say that please, I trust you more than life itself. I was going to tell you that night, but I didn't have the courage to tell you that night. I was scared, frightened, and so lost. If it weren't for you, I would be dead. He was silenced as Temari put her fingers on his lips and didn't let him finish. SHH, don't ever say that to Naruto. She whispered and he nodded, holding her to his chest. When will you reveal it to the village? She asked and he smiled. He too wanted to take up his father's name soon, but the time wasn't right yet. I'm not strong enough to protect myself if someone came for me to get revenge on my father and they might use anyone close to me as leverage if they fail. I can't let anyone else be in danger because of me. He whispered and she nodded in his chest. I'll keep it a secret until you're ready, trust me. She whispered and he nodded. I trust you, Mary-chan, more than anyone in the world. He whispered and she blushed a faint pink blush and looked up. What did you call me? She whispered and he realized what he had called her and looked down, not meeting her eyes. He remembered how Sakura used to hit him and curse him when he had called her with an affectionate name and she too hated it, he realized. I'm sorry, don't mind me, I didn't mean. He started nervously babbling, not wanting to lose her friendship too, but was silenced as Temari put her fingers on his lips and gave him a heartwarming smile. Hush, I don't mind. In fact, from now on call me that, alright? She said softly and his eyes watered. She didn't mind it, he thought, and she pulled him into a hug. Arigato, Mary-chan. He whispered and she nodded, running her fingers through his hair and had a faint pink blush, liking the way he called her so affectionately. You never have to thank me, Naru-kun. She whispered and he nodded and looked up at the way she had called him and she sensed the origin of his confusion and answered. You didn't think you could call me that, right? She asked playfully and he smiled, shaking his head. No, Mary-chan, you can call me whatever you like. He said in a small voice and she put a hand over his cheek and rubbed his cheek as he leaned into her touch. He was never close to anyone and no one showed him any physical contact and he liked it, he thought. Naru-kun, you don't have to be scared of talking to me like that. Speak what you want with me, alright, I won't get angry, I promise. She said softly, rubbing his cheek, and he nodded. She wanted him to get out of that shell he had receded himself into. He nodded, smiling gratefully as he went into the kitchen and both had breakfast and sat in a comfortable silence before Temari spoke up. Hey Naruto, you know how to play shogi? She asked suddenly and he looked at her surprised and shook his head. No, no one really played with me before, but if you explain the rules I might be able to play. He said in a small voice and she nodded and beamed. No one liked to play shogi with her since they thought it was boring and she always won. She got up and walked up into her room and went through her closet, finding what she was looking for and came down to the living room with a board and laid it in the middle of the couch as both sat in front of each other. Alright Naruto, this is a strategy game just like a real battlefield, it requires strategy, now I'll explain the pieces and rules, alright? She said and he nodded. Kankuro came back from patrolling along with Gaara for breakfast to see Temari and Naruto ready to play shogi. Hey Naruto, you don't have to play with her, it's no fun, she always wins. He said and Temari smirked. That's because you're too dumb to play a mind game instead of those dolls. And my mind is one of the best strategic minds in the village, you idiot. Temari said tauntingly and he fumed at the insult. Temari, you shouldn't underestimate your opponent. Said Gaara stoically and she looked at him with a smirk. Please Gaara, no one has ever beaten me in shogi and I just explained the rules to him. She said smugly as Kankuro spoke up. Yeah Gaara, the kid won't win, I hate to say it but I bet he doesn't win even if he played 10 games. Said Kankuro and Gaara's lips twitched upwards. I'll take that bet. I bet 500 ryo on Naruto. He said monotonously and Kankuro looked at him with a raised eyebrow. Lied, it's your money if you want to lose it so badly, you're on. He said with a smirk as Naruto glanced at him nervously. Gaara Temari's right. It's my first time playing it and I'm not good at strategies and you can lose a lot of money. He said nervously as Gaara put a hand over his shoulder. Uzumaki, if there's one thing I know about you is to never count you out. You have a knack for pulling the unexpected. He said and Naruto nodded hesitatingly. Alright Mary-chan, let's play. He said softly and she nodded with a smile. Kankuro raised an eyebrow at the affectionate name and saw that she didn't mind it, maybe he should try it too. Yeah, Mary-chan won me some money. He said with a perverted chuckle indicating something and Gaara took a step back and the temperature in the room dropped as Temari's bangs shadowed her eyes. What did you just call me? She asked sweetly with a very sweet smile as Kankuro started sweating. A moment later his screams were heard in the village as Temari beat him to an inch of his life with her battle fan and Naruto and Gaara decided to do the intelligent thing and stood back. Shouldn't we, help him? Naruto asked Gaara nervously who looked at him incredulously. You want to risk getting that? He asked in disbelief as Naruto glanced at Kankuro. Not there, not there. Oh my jewels, he shouted as both Gaara and Naruto winced and Naruto walked up to Temari and wrapped his arms around her waist from behind and put his chin on her shoulder, calming her down. Mary-chan, that's enough, I think he has had enough. It was just a joke. He said softly and she put down her fan and smiled as her anger died down and turned her eyes to Kankuro hiding behind Gaara's leg. Alright, but if you call me that again or give any insinuation like that, chuckle. She said leaving the threat hanging in the air and he nodded furiously. All of them sat around the board as Temari made the first move as Naruto asked her to and he instantly moved his piece. This went on like this for an hour as she would think furiously for a few moments and Naruto would instantly move his piece. Temari was getting frustrated as Naruto moved his next piece instantly and captured her king. That's checkmate Mary-chan. He said softly and she gave out a frustrated cry and Kankuro's jaw dropped to the ground and Gaara smirked. How did you do that? You have no strategy, you move your pieces instantly without thinking about the moves ahead and this is your first time playing it. How did you do that? You are so. She said in a frustrated tone as Gaara finished her sentence. Unpredictable. He said calmly and she nodded, slumping in defeat as she looked at Naruto with curious eyes. Who was grinning. Wow Mary-chan, that was fun and you are good, you almost got me a couple of times. We should do this again sometime. He said in a happy voice and she smiled. Her anger died down seeing him happy and she nodded with a smile. Gaara put his hand in front of Kankuro who grumbled and emptied his wallet in his hand and Gaara counted the money slowly to infuriate him and he fumed. Alright, I'm going out to train. He said and they nodded as he walked out and went towards the training fields. Time skip 2 weeks later. 2 weeks had passed and Naruto had been training hard to bring his body and jutsu to a good level. He had played shogi several times with Temari in the night, with each time him winning or losing, when Temari tricked him to look at her or somewhere else and would change the pieces, and both would laugh after a few moments of staring blankly at each other, with Naruto tackling and tickling her as she begged for him to stop, and both would roll on the bed and fall asleep laughing and in each other's arms. He had visited Lady Chiyo a couple of times and she had told him all about his parents and how they were in life and how much she loved his mother and respected his father, though resented Konoha as a whole all that much. She had started giving Temari medical lessons when she went with him and he found out that Lady Chiyo was one of the best medic nins and poison experts in the elemental nations, second best only to Tsunade as was seen in the Second Great Shinobi War where she bested her poisons every time she came up with a new one. Naruto was going through his father's taijutsu katas and suddenly a gust of wind came towards him as he jumped back and saw Temari standing there, one hand on her hip and the other on her fan as she stood there grinning. A blush crept across his face as he saw her new attire. She wore a blue battle kimono with a deep neck cut which was mostly covered by the Anbu armor over it and a red belt tied on her waist flowing in the air and a dark blue skirt with slits on both sides showing of her toned creamy legs and the usual fishnet she wore on her legs. She wore her now black headband on her neck with black shinobi sandals to match. THEM search for the pic of Temari at the end of part 1 on Google or Narutopedia. Naruto thought he hadn't seen a kunoichi look this deadly and beautiful before. Hey Mary-chan. He said softly and she walked up to him and stood before him. They had spared a couple of times in taijutsu before in the past weeks and found out that it was her weakness which she was now trying to get fixed by learning her family's style, which was a defensive style as her family has always relied on some form of long-range offensive style before and it was created to work out their weakness at close combat. Let's have a spar alright. she said, and he nodded as both took a few steps back as she opened her fan to the first moon and blew it towards him as Naruto jumped sideways and put his hands in a cross-hand seal. Ninja art, multi-shadow clone jutsu, he yelled, and created 30 clones who divided into 3 battalions and covered her as they were about to charge. She opened up the fan to the third moon and channeled chakra to her fan as it hummed and glowed. Wind style, wind scythe jutsu, she said, opening her fan completely and crouching down, swinging her fan at a 270-degree angle, taking out all the clones, and her eyes widened. The real wasn't amongst them. She tried to turn back, but an arm wrapped around her waist and held her close to a strong chest from the back as a kunai was on her neck. Naruto pulled her closer, her whole body pressed against his as he whispered. "Yield, Mary-chan." He whispered in her ear, sending shivers down her spine, and she turned around in his arms and gazed into his cerulean eyes as she tripped him and disarmed him, pinning him on the ground as she had a leg on either side of his waist and her face in front of his. "You lose, Naru-kun." She whispered softly in his ear, and Naruto gazed into her eyes and whispered breathlessly before he leaned up and captured her lips. "Hi, you win," he said before capturing her pink and soft supple lips as she was wide-eyed for a moment before she relaxed and returned the kiss, putting her hand behind his neck, deepening the kiss. She had a mischievous thought as she licked his bottom lip softly, and he gasped as she took advantage of it and pushed her tongue into his mouth, exploring it. Naruto was stunned as she did that, but after a moment he relaxed and massaged her tongue, softly letting her do what she wanted to as she kept exploring his mouth and was grateful that he was just gently massaging her tongue and letting her do what she wanted, not pushing her for anything. They broke off after a couple of minutes as Temari was flushed with a scarlet blush on her face, and Naruto had his eyes glazed for a moment before he brought her head down, putting it in the crook of his neck and holding her against him. Her body pressed tightly against his as he had her wrapped around him. Temari just wrapped her arms around his waist and sighed in content with a smile, closing her eyes as she snuggled into him. Both stayed silent as Naruto took off her bands holding her hair and letting it flow freely as he ran his fingers through her silky blonde hair and took in her scent that he loved. He admitted that he had developed feelings for the Kunoichi, and this wasn't the petty stupid crush he had back in Konoha, this was something more. He rubbed her back as she snuggled into his neck and he smiled. He liked holding her close to him. It just completed him, but it was wrong, she didn't deserve someone like him. She was a princess of the village and any guy will be happy to be close to her. She deserved someone better. He had to stop before anything else happened. "Mary-chan." He whispered and felt her breath on his neck as she kissed him a little on his neck. "MMHMM." She softly moaned and he ran his fingers through her hair. "We should stop this." He whispered and her eyes snapped open as she gazed into his eyes with hurt in her eyes as her bottom lip trembled. Her eyes watered as she thought of why he had said this. "You don't like me? Am I not pretty enough? Or am I too hard-headed for you?" She asked in a hurt tone and his eyes widened and he averted his eyes. "No, it isn't you, it's me." He whispered and now she was confused. "What do you mean?" She asked softly, keeping a hand on his cheek, forcing him to look at her as she saw a tear roll down his eye. "You are a princess of the village, you deserve someone better, not someone like." He was cut off as she crashed her lips on his and he melted in her kiss. She gave him the most passionate kiss she could muster as she broke off, both breathing hard. "I really like you, Naruto, I haven't felt this way for anyone before. I trust you and when you hold me I feel safe. I don't even let my guard down in front of my brothers, but with you it's different. I don't know what it is, but I want you to hold me forever. I can't sleep without holding you, and when I'm with you I feel vulnerable, but the simplest of those touches you give me to reassure me, I feel like I can do anything. You cook and take care of me like a princess, and I like those small things that you take care of for me. You never even look or glance at me in an undecent way, and I love that innocence behind all the pain and sorrow in those deep blue cerulean pools you look at me with. Please Naruto, just tell me this, do you like me too?" She asked softly, rubbing his whiskers as he said nothing for a moment before he flipped her around and crashed his lips onto her, answering her with the passionate kiss he wanted so much. He licked her bottom lip gently and she opened her mouth, giving him access as she put one hand behind his neck, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss, and the other grabbing his hair as he explored her mouth and she massaged his tongue softly. He loved how soft her tongue was and how she had given her access as he explored her cavern bit by bit and broke off the kiss as she whined a bit at the loss of contact, but he kissed her jawline softly and she moaned and breathed hardly. He went down to her neck as she turned her head away, giving him more access as she held his head closer and he kissed and licked the soft skin of her neck. He pulled off the Anbu armor and threw it aside and pulled her blue kimono a bit sideways as now she was a bit worried about what he wanted to do. He sensed her tension and started kissing gently and softly on her neck, going upwards. He kissed, nipped and licked her neck, gently working his way to her ear as he nibbled it softly, getting another soft moan from her lips. "Don't worry." He whispered softly in her ear, and just like that all her doubts vanished. He won't do anything to harm her in any way, she thought as he kissed her lips softly and pulled away as she tried to deepen it. He kissed her jawline, gently moving down, and kissed and licked her neck gently and softly, and she loved his gentle touches on her sensitive skin, and slowly he pulled the blue part of the kimono he went for earlier a bit sideways and got access to her collarbone as he put his lips down on the creamy and soft skin of her sweet spot as he licked and kissed it, and her breathing was now becoming so hard, her C-cup breasts heaving up and down heavily. She felt herself getting wet, and her panties were feeling drenched as Naruto picked her thigh up, touching and softly rubbing the fishnet-less thigh softly and gently as he captured her lips, and this time both took out their tongues at the same time, battling for dominance as Naruto broke it off. After a few moments and again gently put kisses on the other side of her neck as she turned her head the other way, giving him full access, and he pulled her kimono sideways and licked and kissed her collarbone gently and softly. She was breathing erratically now, and her moans and gasps becoming faster and louder as they filled the training field, and Naruto felt his hand on her inner thigh that he was massaging softly, feeling the soft and creamy skin of her inner thigh was now feeling drenched. She was so close to her orgasm, and Naruto gave her the final push as he bit down hard on her neck, giving her a hickey as the dam broke from the pleasure and pain as she came hard. "Naru-kun," she said loudly and breathlessly, moaning his name as her orgasm came, and Naruto licked off the bit of blood from her neck, kissing it, gently easing off her pain as she brought his head up and pecked him with her now swollen pink lips and brought his head to the crook of her neck and closed her eyes, running her fingers through his hair as Naruto snuggled into her neck and pecked it, pulling the strand of hair aside, and closed his eyes as both breathed hard and were now exhausted. A moment later Temari started giggling like a schoolgirl, and Naruto glanced at her curiously, seeing the state she was in and her scarlet blush on her cheeks. He himself was having trouble fighting off the blush. Her hair was disheveled and her silky blonde hair now flowing around with her kimono loose down to the edge of her breasts and showing off bits of her pink bra. Her skirt was up and showed him her drenched pink panties with his hand still on the inner side of her thigh as she looked at him lovingly with her arms around his neck, and he asked her what she was giggling about softly, and she answered, "That was my first time kissing anyone, and I have to say not many girls can say that their first time kissing was that amazing," she said softly and playfully, and he chuckled softly and pecked her lips and buried his face in her neck, taking in her scent. It was his first time kissing, actually being this close to a girl, and the spark that he felt was something out of this world as a question came out of his lips unconsciously. "Temari, would you be my girlfriend?" he asked softly, and her eyes widened in surprise, and Naruto quickly continued, not wanting her to think he was forcing her into anything. "It's alright if you don't want to. I don't know a lot about relationships or dating, but I wanted to know." He was cut off as Temari captured his lips and stopped his babbling and looked at him lovingly as she broke off. "Of course I will be an idiot. I don't care about the way others go about dating, but you're mine now and I'm not letting you go," she said softly, and he pecked her lips gently as he looked at her with all the love he could muster. "And those soft pink lips now belong to me and I'm not letting you go," he said softly, and she smiled as she held his face to her neck, and both fell asleep from the soft breeze of the few trees in the training field, and the shade of the tree they were under gave them a lot of comfort. Naruto woke up a couple of hours later to see himself wrapped in Temari's arms, who was sleeping soundly, and saw that it was nearly sunset as he kissed her neck, gently getting a soft moan from the sleeping girl, and pecked her lips as she opened her eyes and smiled at him, wrapping her arms around his neck and gazing into his eyes lovingly. "Hey handsome," she said softly, and he smiled. "Hey beautiful," he answered softly, and both leaned in and kissed each other passionately and broke off with a trail of saliva, and both looking flushed and breathing heavily and gazing at each other in love as the orange light of the sunset fell on the field, making it a truly majestic sight. And just as the sun dipped, both leaned in for the final kiss of the evening and broke off as the sky now had little light and broke off from their kiss as Naruto's lower lip bled a bit from the bite Temari gave him as she kissed a bit of blood away, and both got up. Temari fixed her clothes and pulled on her Anbu armor and tied a red waistband which flowed with the breeze and put her hair in a single high ponytail that came to her waist, since it wasn't now divided into the usual 4 pigtails. Both started walking out of the fields as they came into the shopping district of the village, and Temari put her head on his shoulder and wrapped her body against his arm, and Naruto wrapped his arm, pulling her closer, and both walked slowly, gathering glances and whispers all over the village, not caring in the slightest as they went home. They put off their shinobi equipment, and Temari dropped her Anbu armor, now only in her slit skirt and blue deep neck kimono. Naruto started making dinner and she stood beside him, leaning against the counter as he stood beside her, ready to start chopping the vegetables when she spoke up. "Do you need any help?" she asked, looking down, fiddling with her feet, a faint pink blush on her face, and he raised an eyebrow. He knew she didn't know how to cook but wanted to be close to him and smiled as he caught her wrist, spun her around as she squealed and held her back against his chest with his chin on her shoulder and put the knife in her hand as he put his hands on hers and started chopping. Temari had a scarlet blush on her face and loved being so closely held against him. "You're an even better cook than I am," he said softly and playfully in her ear as he put her hand on the handle of the pan, putting the cut vegetables in the boiling water for the soup, and she elbowed him giggling as he prepared the tempura for the shrimp in the same way. Ara and Kankuro came into the kitchen and watched with stupefied expressions at the couple that were giggling and cooking lost in their old world. Kankuro's jaw was on the ground as he was pointing his finger at them and his jaw moved up and down, but no words came out. Ara came out of his stupor and smirked. "Yes, they finally got together," he said as he looked at them in disbelief, and both walked beside the couple gaining their attention as both Naruto and Temari smiled at them and Temari had a blush on her face. "What have you done to my sister? She never acts this nicely to anyone," Kankuro said stupidly as the temperature in the room dropped and Gaara took a couple of steps sideways from the now shaking boy. "What did you just say?" she asked sweetly and Kankuro turned pale as a sheet and started apologizing and holding his hands in front of his jewels, but she didn't want to have any of that. She tried to get off Naruto's hold, but he just held tighter and nibbled her ear, getting a soft moan, and gently kissed her neck softly at several points, gaining a couple of more soft moans as she held her head sideways, giving him access and her anger forgotten. Naruto stopped and put his chin on her shoulder, their cheeks touching as she put a hand on his cheek and smiled. "He said sorry and he didn't mean it, Mary-chan, you can forgive him, can't you?" he asked softly and she nodded, rubbing his whisker marks and melted in his arms as he rubbed her stomach softly. "Alright," she whispered with closed eyes and Naruto smiled and glanced at Kankuro who was crying and I'm tears at being saved and Gaara was smiling. "Take care of my sister Uzumaki," said Gaara and he smiled and nodded as all of them had dinner with Temari being pulled on Naruto's lap and both feeding each other and went to their rooms. Naruto changed in his usual night clothes and got in bed as Temari came and got in bed with him in her usual nightwear and he switched off the light. Only moonlight coming in through the window as they kissed passionately for a few moments and broke off, breathing heavily as Temari put her head on his chest and closed her eyes with Naruto running his fingers through her free-flowing blonde hair and both had smiles on their faces with blushes on their cheeks. "Good night, Naru-kun," she whispered, closing her eyes. "Good night, Mary-chan," he whispered and closed his eyes, holding her tightly as she snuggled into his neck and both fell into a deep slumber, enjoying each other's warmth. Naruto opened his eyes as the rays of sunlight flickered over his eyes and a groan escaped his lips as he tried to move but couldn't. He looked down at his chest to see the familiar mop of sandy blonde hair that he loved so much and smiled. He put his hand gently over her head and started running his fingers through her long blonde hair, tucking in a lock of hair behind her ear as a small smile graced her lips and she snuggled her face in the crook of his neck and kissed it softly in her sleep, making him chuckle. He saw that she was in a deep slumber, but he had to wake her up and get started on his training. Over the past month since they were together, they hadn't been able to spend much time together since Gaara had her doing missions continuously, with her being called the Wind Mistress of the Sand for her impeccable record in missions. Naruto was happy that she had been promoted to Jounin yesterday since the forces needed some high-ranking and skilled shinobi in the higher tier of the shinobi forces and with her strategic mind along with the respect she held in the village. Both due to her performance and her name and status in the village, her promotion was unanimous in the vote done by the village council. He brushed the locks of silky blonde hair falling on her face and brushed them off as he leaned down and captured her small and soft pink lips in a kiss. Temari was in a deep sleep when she felt something pressed against her lips and opened her eyes groggily to see, but the sensation on her lips told her what it was and she wrapped her arms around his neck as she now lay on top of him and he had one hand buried in her hair and the other soothingly rubbing her lower back just above the waistband of the panties that were the only thing covering her at the moment apart from the loose t-shirt she wore to sleep. She loved those gentle touches he gave her and made her melt in his arms, but would never do anything that would take it too far. She trusted him so much that over the past month she had become comfortable enough to wear just a t-shirt and panties in her sleep and never once had Naruto give her even a wrong touch that would make her feel uncomfortable or try anything to fool around. Flashback. She still remembered last night, she had been dead tired from the continuous missions that had been straining her and had come home in the evening dead tired to see Naruto just come back from his own training in the same condition as her. He had still cooked her dinner with her favorite side dish and had asked her to come to the room early and get changed just in a towel. She was stunned by his request, but had agreed with a smile. The trust she held for him didn't make her doubt him in the slightest. She got into the room to see Naruto in the bathroom and got out of her clothes and wrapped a small towel on herself and lied down on the bed on her stomach, her face in the pillow dead tired. She was barely hanging on to consciousness and was about to fall asleep any moment. She didn't even sense the bathroom door opening and Naruto coming out and sitting down beside her on the bed. She shivered as she felt Naruto's breath on her neck as she felt him give him a small kiss on her neck and let out a soft moan and smiled. She suddenly felt something wet on her shoulders and looked up to see Naruto rolling up his sleeves and looked at him curiously. "So what are you about to do, Naru-kun? Why did you ask me to remove my clothes and get here only in a towel?" She asked softly and he smiled as he kissed her on her cheek softly and nibbled her ear as she let out a soft moan and whispered. "Maryheim, you have been so stressed over the month and your body needs time to rest. I'll take off your stress tonight." He whispered and shivers ran down her spine as she gazed into his cerulean eyes gazing at her lovingly and nodded. She felt him rub the wet substance all over her uncovered shoulders when he started applying pressure and working out the kinks in her shoulders. She immediately understood he was giving her a massage and let out a soft moan as she felt her tense shoulder relaxing. She felt him rubbing her shoulders gently when all of a sudden he would squeeze her hard and she would let out a soft moan. Naru-kun, you didn't have to do this," she said between moans as she felt his breath on her neck and felt him kissing the sensitive skin on her neck, squeezing her arms hardly under him as he nibbled her ear and she let out another soft moan. "You don't seem like complaining." He whispered and started pulling down the towel gently to her waist as she got up a bit to let him and he pulled it down until it reached her lower back and still left her butt covered and started massaging her back with the massaging oil. Sometimes gentle and sometimes harder on the tense muscles where she would let out a soft moan. Naru-kun," she whispered in a moan and he brought his head down to listen to her closely. "Yes," he whispered gently and she smiled. "You scare me sometimes, you know that she said and let out a soft moan as he pushed his hands on a pulled muscle and worked out the pain. "Why is that?" he asked softly and she smiled at the concern and affection in his voice. "The amount of control you have over me with just a touch," her whisper is, "oh right there, too much," she said softly and he rubbed the part she responded to. "You make me come without ever even touching, the wrong way and just with, gentle kisses and touches. You know if you want, that I would give myself to you anytime, right?" She asked between soft moans and gasps and he smiled and brought his lips to her neck, kissing her neck softly and then kissed her softly on the ear, squeezing her forearms tightly as she let out a soft moan. "I would never touch you in any way you don't want and I would die before I force you into anything like that," he said softly and she smiled and got up covering her breast by crossing her arms and holding the towel as she kissed him gently on the lips. "I know," she whispered softly with one hand rubbing his cheek and the other holding the towel. Naruto smiled and turned her around gently, laying her back down in the previous position as he started on her thighs and calves and her soft moans and gasps filled the room again. She was grateful since she knew how tired he was from all the body conditioning and pure high-speed based jutsu he was practicing every day and still did this for her. He stopped after 15 minutes and covered her with a towel again and saw that she was just about to sleep. "Now he just holds on a bit longer for me, alright," he said softly and picked her up bridal style carrying her into the bathroom as she saw the bathtub filled with water and herbs as he put her down in the warm water and all the muscles in her body relaxed and she let out a content sigh. She was thankful for the bath he had prepared for her and would never tell him, but her orgasm came twice in that massage he gave her and now she was feeling exhausted and was barely able to stand. All the oil was washed off from her body as Naruto came in 15 minutes later and picked her up from the bath that was beginning to cold as she wrapped her arms around his neck and knew she was making him wet but he didn't mind the slightest. He put her down behind the changing wooden panel and wrapped her up in a big dry towel and handed her a t-shirt and panties and stood at the other side of the panel. She dried herself off and put on her t-shirt and panties and now her legs were trembling from just standing up. "Naru-kun, I'm done." She whispered embarrassedly that she couldn't even stand up without help and her legs were now numb from the pleasure of the massage and the orgasm she had. Naruto came and picked her up bridal style and she snuggled into his chest, wrapping her arms around his neck as she yawned cutely and Naruto put her on the bed gently and tucked her in the blanket, giving her a small peck on the lips as he walked back, but Temari gripped his wrist. "Where are you going?" she asked and he smiled. "Well, I'll be back after a shower and change of clothes, alright," he said and she softened her hold and nodded. "Hurry up, alright," she said in a pleading and small voice and he bent down and gave her a gentle kiss on the lips as he put a strand of hair behind her ear. "I will, just give me 15 minutes," he said and she let go with a nod as he went into the bathroom and showered changing into his night clothes and came out after 20 minutes and gently got into the blanket switching the lights off as Temari wrapped herself around him and yawned as she kissed his neck and buried her face in it. "You're late," she said in a mock angry voice and he smiled. "I'm sorry but I just missed a precious 5 minutes with an angel, can you blame me?" he asked softly in a playful voice and she smiled. And just who might this angel be? She asked softly and equally playfully. Well, she just has these beautiful blonde hair, teal green eyes that hold all the warmth in the world, and soft small pink lips that just belong to me. He said softly and she let out a mock growl. Well, mister, you're not getting out of your punishment so easily. She said in a mock stern tone, and he smiled mischievously. Is that right? He asked playfully and kissed her nose and started kissing her all over the neck, and she giggled feeling ticklish. Alright, I forgive you, now stop. She said in between giggles, and he stopped and gave her a smile. See, now that wasn't so hard now, was it? He asked gently, cupping her cheek as they put their forehead together, gazing into each other's eyes lovingly. Arigato. She whispered, and he smiled and kissed her forehead, wrapping her up in his arms and putting her head on his chest. Sleep now, you're tired, you need the rest. He said softly and kissed the top of her head, running his fingers in her hair as she yawned and her eyes drooped heavily. Good night, Naru-kun. She whispered as sleep claimed her. Good night, Mary Haim. He whispered, and his own eyes closed as he gave into his own exhaustion. End of flashback. She was broken out of her thoughts as both broke the kiss and both had their foreheads touching and were gazing at each other lovingly. Morning, Naru-kun. She whispered. Morning, Mary Haim. He whispered, and she smiled as both sat up with Naruto leaning his back against the headboard of the bed, and Temari put her head on his shoulder and wrapped her arms around his waist as he brought her closer, pulling her close to him with her waist. Temari stretched her muscles a bit and they felt like they had just been rebuilt, and she felt that she could take on anything. She gazed at Naruto's face and saw that he was tired, his eyes showed her what he was feeling, and she felt guilty that he had done that last night for her, even after his own exhaustion. Then an idea popped into her mind. Naru-kun? She whispered, and he looked down to see her drawing circles on his chest. Yes, he asked, and she looked up to see his eyes looking at her with the same innocence he always had. Take the day off today. Let's celebrate my promotion, we have to have our first date too, you know. She said, and he put his finger under her chin and kissed her lips softly. Alright. He said, and she beamed. Both got up and went downstairs to see Gaara and Kankuro eating a widespread breakfast, and Naruto was confused. Why were they eating breakfast they ordered from the outside when they liked his cooking? Gaara caught his questioning look and spoke up. We thought you might be too tired to cook, so we ordered from the outside. He said stoically, and Naruto nodded as both Temari and Naruto took their seats. Yeah, after all those noises we heard last night we thought the both of you might be too tired. Said Kankuro, giggling perversely as Temari had a scarlet blush on her face and her eye was twitching dangerously at his insinuation. She glanced at Naruto and saw his head tilted to the side in confusion and looking so innocent that she resisted the urge to yell kawaii and glomp him. She turned to Kankuro and decided to explain before Gaara spoke up. Uzumaki, you didn't hurt or force her, did you? If you weren't gentle to her last night, I swear. He said as sand swirled behind him, and Naruto was even more confused. He was quite gentle in his massage in his opinion. I was quite gentle, I think. Did I hurt you? He asked innocently to a tomato-red Temari, who knew he didn't get what he was saying right now, and she decided to clear it all up before Naruto made it all worse, but when she saw the innocence in his eyes, she just put a hand on his lap and he was silenced as he waited for an answer, and she took deep breaths to calm herself down. Listen, Gaara, last night Naruto just gave me a massage, nothing else. You're misunderstanding it. She calmed herself down, and Gaara's eyes widened before he understood his mistake and nodded. I see. He said with a small smile. He should have known those two weren't like that, but Kankuro decided to add his own 2 cents unfortunately. Oh yeah, a massage, what kind of a massage? He asked, giggling perversely as the volcano named Temari exploded. Kankuro was heard all throughout the village, as his screams were heard all throughout the village. Naruto was thinking of calming down Temari, but Gaara put a hand over his shoulder and shook his head. Then he tried to think what the misunderstanding was all about. Hey Gaara, what did you two think we were doing last night? He asked innocently, and Gaara answered. We thought you two were having sex. He said stoically, and Naruto became as red as a tomato. Oh, he said intelligently, and knew Kankuro was now all on his own. Temari wasn't going to stop until she was done with him. Both Gaara and Naruto ate, ignoring the screams of the puppeteer, as after a few moments Temari came dusting off her hands, leaving an unrecognizable Kankuro behind, and ate happily. Temari, I have an idea for the date if you would like to hear it. Naruto said shyly, and she smiled. He was a great and cheerful person ever since she had broken him out of his shell and back to his happy self, but was now a bit calmer than before. No one knew it except her, but he was a shy boy when it came to romantic stuff, and she knew he didn't have any idea what dating was, but was still attempting to do it for her, so she nodded. Alright Naruto, you surprised me today, alright. She said, and he nodded, happy that she trusted him to plan the date. Alright Temari, get ready, we are going to spend the whole day together on our date. He said happily, and she smiled. Gaara too smiled seeing his sister and best friend so happy and he admitted that they made a fine couple. Naruto prepared the food for lunch and put it all in a basket and sealed it in a scroll as he dressed up in his usual clothes and waited for Temari to come down. He heard footsteps from behind and his breath was caught in his throat as he saw Temari come down. She was wearing a thigh-length white silk kimono with blue desert lilies embroidered on the bottom and had her hair done in a loose bun with a needle holding it and her two bangs loose from her usually tied hair framing her face. She was wearing blue shinobi sandals and no makeup, not that she needed it in his opinion, and was gazing at him with curious eyes and a faint pink blush on her face. "So how do I look?" She squeaked out timidly and he walked up to her as she was looking down too embarrassed to look at him. He brought her chin up and captured her lips in a small kiss and nibbled her ear, getting a soft moan, and smiled at his ability to make her so sensitive to his touches. "For a moment there you took my breath away," he whispered and she blushed a scarlet red blush and buried her face in his shoulder, too embarrassed to look at him, and Naruto chuckled softly and wrapped her up in his arms as she wrapped her arms around his waist. "Baka," she whispered and he chuckled at her embarrassed voice. "Really, so I am a baka to think I am so pretty?" he asked playfully and she punched his chest and looked at him trying to glare but failing with the blush present on her face. "Yes, you're still a baka. But you're my baka," she said softly and buried her face in his neck as she knew he was smiling at her blush and she was too embarrassed to show it to him. "I should wear something nice too. I didn't know we were supposed to dress up for dates," he said and she looked up at him with a smile. She knew all about his social problems and never once had she minded it in the least. So what if he didn't do the things that usually couples do? His innocent eyes and loving heart made it all up for it and even beyond it, in her opinion. "No, I chose your clothes, remember, you look handsome enough as it is, I don't want to beat the girls off of you," she said happily and he grinned foxily at her. "Why, afraid someone might steal me?" he asked playfully and she looked at him annoyed. "As if let those sluts try, I'll beat them out of it with my fans," she said as two fans appeared from her loose kimono sleeves and he smiled. She was a true kunoichi, always ready for a battle, not like those fangirls he saw in his old village. He kissed her neck gently licking and kissing her sensitive points as her breathing became erratic and she let out a soft moan and he smiled pecking her lips as he brought his mouth to her ear. "You're the only one I want to hear those soft moans from," he said softly and she hugged him tightly expressing how much she cared for him and loved him. He wrapped his arms around her as she melted in his arms. "Alright, let's go marry Haim, we still have that date, you know," he said and she nodded as both left the Sabaku estate and walked through the village. Temari was wrapped up against him with him holding by her waist and her head on his shoulder. Most of the shop owners smiled and waved at them since they were the most popular couple in the village and almost everyone knew about him now due to Temari. Temari, who already had a fan club in the village, had fewer boys chasing after her since they knew she only had eyes for Naruto and none had the balls to stand against her brother. Naruto apparently had his own little fan club which annoyed Temari to no end since she had found a couple of girls flirting with him, telling him how good his exotic features were. Naruto, being the ever-oblivious one, thought it was good to be praised and was thanking them, not understanding they were flirting, until Temari had scared them off and had scolded him lightly like a mother would with her hands on her hips and he had apologized saying he didn't know. She couldn't even stay mad as she had looked at his innocent eyes apology and had forgiven him instantly hugging him, saying it was alright. "So where are we going, Naru-kun?" she whispered and he smiled, holding her waist tightly and kissed the top of her head as she snuggled into his shoulder. "That's a surprise to him, but I think you like it. I found it myself last week and it's a great place," he said and now her curiosity was raised as they walked towards the residential area of the village that was still scarce and was mostly for sale to new residents and walked into a clearing. Suddenly Naruto stopped and got behind her and as she tried to turn, but he held her close and in place by her stomach and put another hand on her eyes as she smiled already knowing what he was doing. "What are you doing, Naru-kun?" she asked and he answered as he put his head on her shoulder, their cheeks touching and Temari leaned in to make their contact closer and he smiled as their cheeks were now together. "Walk with me, I want to surprise you," he said softly and she nodded as he started to walk slowly with her to a part of the clearing as they walked slowly and Temari stumbled a few times giggling as Naruto kept her in place. She noticed that suddenly she felt the air quite colder and a lot less dry as she smelled the smell of wet muddy soil and trees and heard the sound of water falling and stopped as Naruto held her closer and nibbled her ears softly as she giggled and he whispered. "Alright, we're here. So are you ready?" he asked and she nodded with a smile as Naruto put his hand out and she opened her eyes slowly and her eyes widened as her heart skipped a beat. She put her hands over her mouth in surprise. She saw that they were in a strange cave which was as big as the Sabaku estate and there were trees in here and greenery like she had never before seen in Suna. There was a small waterfall coming from a crack in the cave which led a small stream through the cave. She saw many small white tiger cubs playing as a small cub came near her legs rubbing himself against her, and she picked him up softly cradling him in her arms as he looked at her with wide curious eyes, and she kissed his nose as he purred softly and nuzzled in her arms. She smiled brushing his soft fur as it walked up her arms and shoulders and wrapped itself behind her neck and fell asleep as she giggled at the cute little cub. She turned to Naruto who was standing watching the interaction with a smile. "Where are we, Naru-kun? How did you find this place?" she asked in a trance and he smiled. "Well, that cub that you have on your neck sleeping is Kiara, my personal summon of the White Tiger clan. A week ago I tried to summon to see if I could still summon the toads and landed in the realm of the White Tiger clan. Their leader Lord Fenrir accepted me as their summoner and came to see where I lived. He could become small like a normal tiger and walked around the village outside of the view of people and said that this place was too barren for the summoner of the prideful White Tiger clan. He came with me here and saw this small barren hill, then asked me to break the hill at a certain point. I smashed a Rasengan and the opening to this cave opened up. We came in to see this big round barren cave and he reverse summoned the elder tigers here who used their skills with nature chakra that they said they would train me in the future and changed it into this. I opened up some holes restricted by environment seals that only let sunlight come in and there you have it," he said pointing to the cave with his arms and she looked around at the majestic place. "I have talked about it to Gaara and he has bought this place for me and I'll pay him back after I collect enough money. This place is restricted by heavy Uzumaki barrier seals attuned only to mine and your chakra and I will build my house here to live here and raise my family here. Most probably with you." He whispered the last part out very slowly, but Temari heard it and smiled as she hugged him tightly. "This is a great place to raise our family here one day, Naru-kun," she said softly and he looked at her with wide eyes. "Are you saying that you want to raise a family with me?" he asked in a really nervous and hopeful tone, and Temari smiled. She had never felt this sure for anything, but knew that he was the only one she would spend her life with. "Yes, Naru-kun, you're the only one I would want to spend my life with, that is if you would want to," she said in a questioning tone at Naruto who was staring at her as she rubbed his whiskers when he suddenly wrapped his arms around her and kissed her passionately. Their lips moved in a synchronized manner as Naruto licked her bottom lip softly and she opened her mouth as he explored her mouth and she massaged his tongue, letting him do what he wanted. He broke off the kiss after 2 minutes as both were breathing heavily and she saw tears streaming down his eyes when he suddenly captured her lips again and she moaned as their tongues battled for dominance and held his golden hair as she pushed her tongue in his mouth and he massaged it gently. Then they broke off. She saw he was still crying when he embraced her in the tightest hug he had ever held her in and sobbed as she held him and ran her fingers in his hair, trying to calm him down. "Why are you crying, Naru-kun? What's wrong?" she asked softly, gently cradling his head in her chest as he spoke in between sobs. "Do you really mean it? You want to have a family with me?" he asked softly in between hiccups and she smiled as she kissed his tears away and nodded. He smiled as he buried his face in her chest and she held him tightly. Now she understood, he was finally happy that someone accepted him and was willing to give him the one thing he craved for most in this world, family. Naruto felt he had achieved something in his life he had never thought was possible for him before. Someone was willing to spend her whole life with him and accepted him completely knowing everything about him. "I love you, Mary-chan," he whispered softly in her chest and she smiled and kissed his forehead gently and gazed at him lovingly. "I love you too, Naru-kun," she whispered as a tear of her own rolled down her eye and she gave him a smile with a gentle push on his lips with her own, pouring all her heart into it to let him know how much she loved him. The boy who had captured her heart in such a short time who she trusted with her life and soul. Both sat down by the small stream with their feet in the water holding each other as every now and then one would kiss the other and were lost in their own little world as lunchtime came and Naruto unsealed it as they sat underneath a tree and Naruto unsealed the food. She smiled as she saw all of her favorite things being pulled out, from tempura fried lobster cutlets, white crab soup and some cold strawberry flavored milkshake, for which she asked how it was still so cold and he answered grinning. The beauty of sealing was the answer she got. It must have cost him a lot, she mused, and both ate as they spent their time making small talk with 2 or 3 makeout sessions every hour and didn't even realize when it was night. They took some food from the restaurant and went straight to their room as Naruto sat with Temari, her back against his chest and his arms wrapped around her stomach. Both were reading a small book on a simple romantic couple and eating the food they brought with them slowly as Temari turned the page when Naruto said he had read it. Occasionally Naruto would kiss her neck or nibble her ear softly, getting a giggle or a soft moan out of her. As they finally finished the small book, Naruto spoke up. "You know, they weren't nearly as romantic as us," he said, and she giggled as she turned around and sat on his lap, her head resting on his shoulder as he had one arm wrapped around her waist and one playing with her free-flowing hair. "Really?" She asked playfully, and he smiled at his mischievous girlfriend and started kissing her all over her face and neck, making her giggle from the ticklish kisses he laid on her. Alright, you're right, we're more romantic than anyone, so stop please. She said as tears came from her eyes from laughing as he stopped and both rested in each other's arms as Naruto pulled up a blanket up to their necks and Temari snuggled into his arms, burying her face in his neck, kissing it softly. As she yawned cutely and closed her eyes, sighing happily. The day was the best day of my life, Naru-kun. She said softly, gazing into his eyes lovingly. Mine too. He said softly, returning her gaze and pushed his lips to her, gently kissing her lips as both broke off and closed their eyes, snuggling into each other's arms as Naruto switched the lights off. Good night, Mary-chan. He whispered, kissing the top of her head and closing his eyes as he pulled her closer by her waist. Good night, Naru-kun. She whispered, giving him a soft kiss on his neck and snuggling her face into it as she closed her eyes and slept, claiming the both of them. Tsunade was sitting in her office going through paperwork and had black rings under her eyes from the lack of sleep she had from the stress that had accumulated on her over the years. She was the one who was hit the hardest with Naruto's banishment in the whole village. She had resorted to Sake as her relief, but that too only temporarily resolved her pain. She had turned vicious towards the council, especially the esteemed elders, or the mummies as she liked to call them. She had tried to change the opinion of the council, but they were firm on their opinion, along with the Fire Daimyo support. Only the feudal lord had the power to overturn the decision for Naruto, but she knew he wouldn't get his hands into such a trivial matter. She was broken out of her musings as Shizune came in saying the council was called. She grit her teeth knowing that those dead weights on the face of the earth would do or say something to completely destroy her already stressed situation. Hokage Tower. Council Chambers. The Konoha Council was called as the clan head sat to the right side of the table with the civilian council to the left and the clan elders at the front. They were all murmuring on trivial things as Tsunade entered and took her seat at the head of the table with a stern expression on her face. Alright, who has called this meeting and why? And trust me, there better be a good reason for this or else I won't be really happy. She said in a cold tone as both sides of the council gulped from her tone and glanced at each other to see who had called the meeting. We have called the meeting, Tsunade, said Kaharu, and Tsunade narrowed her eyes at the old coot. It's Hokage-sama to you, esteemed elder Kaharu. Remember that her Anko will remind you to know how to address your superiors personally. Now may I know the reason for this urgent meeting that you have called us here for? She stated coldly, and the council was silent as everyone knew how vicious she had turned after the banishment of the demon brat. Kaharu sweated at her tone and threat and nodded. My apologies, Hokage-sama, but we have some important information and some situations we would like to address with you, said Kaharu, and Tsunade nodded, motioning her to continue on as she spoke up. As you know, Hokage-sama, since the last year our alliances with the Wave and Spring countries have been in turmoil for the past 2 years, and now they have finally broken all alliances. As the 3-year trade alliances with them came for renewal, they completely rejected them and have allied themselves to Suna now completely, and they have said to have gained an even better alliance contract than us, said Kaharu as Tsunade raised an eyebrow at her words. Oh, how so? Asked Tsunade curiously, and Homura spoke up this time. Earlier in our alliances we were allied only for mutual trade contracts. It was a give and take sort of a relationship. They supplied us with their resources, and we complied with the contract and supplied them with the native resources of the Land of Fire. He said, and Tsunade nodded, already knowing it, as he continued. But their alliance for Suna is completely different. Since Suna isn't as rich in the native plantations that we possess, they have decided to give their own resources in return. He said, and Tsunade looked at him confused. And what is the problem with that? She asked, and Kaharu replied. Since Suna is mainly rich only in metals or precious stones, they have put in the alliance to give those to them at a lesser price, getting their resources in return for the reconciliation, said Kaharu, and Tsunade understood everything. Suna gained resources and even managed to sell them their own, while the Leaf only exchanged them at the exchange price laid down in the alliance, which gave Suna the deal in which they could manage their own prices, which meant Suna had complete control. Homura, however, continued. Moreover, Spring and Wave have put a term in the alliance that Suna will provide them with the military might they need, making them the only village that gets their contracts for missions, as well as the other employers who they work with. The daimyo is pretty angry at losing such precious alliances with us, and after hearing the benefits of the alliance that he could have gotten, and is demanding answers. Homura finished, and Tsunade had to say that it was quite a great deal. Suna must have had a good negotiator to pull off such a great deal. Well, that is bad news that we have lost such great allies for trade alliances, but it's nice that they haven't been lost towards one of our enemy villages. Any idea on why they would have decided to end an alliance with the Leaf? She asked as the elders glanced at each other for a moment before shaking their heads, and Tsunade had her eyes narrowed. They knew something but weren't telling her, so she decided to ask about dismissing the council, when much to her ire, her least favorite person on the council spoke up. "Actually Tsunade-sama, there is one more issue we would like to discuss," said Danzo, and she motioned for him to continue on. "We have come across some information about the new security system employed by the Sand Village," he said, and her eyes narrowed. "And how exactly would you have come across some top secret information about a village's internal security system?" she asked, and he cursed under his breath. He had slipped up and now she was on to him. "That's not important, the issue at hand is," he said, and she motioned for him to continue as he had dodged a bullet, but she kept it in her mind to look into the matter later. "They have erected a new barrier system that is in many ways similar to our own," he said, and the clan heads protested that they must have stolen it from the Leaf, but Tsunade told them to calm down and listen to the man as Danzo continued. "It couldn't have been stolen from us, since it is a much better system than us," he said, and the room became deathly silent. Their internal security system was the best and the Leaf prided themselves in it. If Suna had created an even better security system, then that was news to the world about the might of the village. "Our system only tells us if a shinobi has entered the village or not, but their system allows them to instantly become alert in case of a breach and locate the intruder, since the whole village's people's chakra signature has been added to the system, making it almost impossible to breach Suna. They have made their village into a fortress, they can see the world, but the world can't see what is going on inside their village. Their system is unbreachable," he said, and the whole council was at a loss for words. It was truly a remarkable system to have for the village, making it impossible for any spies to get in. Moreover, in the previous few years their quality of sealing equipment has increased dramatically. Their exploding tags are much more powerful than before at almost twice the strength of our own. And their other sealing equipment too has increased in complexity much more dramatically. He finished, shocking the council once more. "Looks like this is all the work of someone who possesses excessive knowledge of," said Shikaku, and everyone nodded in agreement. But Suna was never known for its sealing arts. Lady Chio was their last seal master, and she doesn't even hold a candle to Master Jiraiya in sealing, and he is just a level 8 seal master. Plus, where did they gain the knowledge of such a high level to train such a great seal master? Said Hiashi, and everyone nodded again. To make that much of a difference in so much in such little time was unexpected and the work of a true seal master. But how could it be? "Our seals were handed down to us by Shadame-sama himself," said Shikaku, and Tsunade snorted as everyone looked at her curiously. "Please, my grandfather wasn't a seal master at the level to create such high-quality seals that have been handed down to us," she said, and everyone was confused, and Tsunade continued. "All of our complex seals were handed down to us by my grandmother Mito Senju, formerly known as Mito Uzumaki of the once great Uzumaki clan of Uzushiogakure no Sado. The barrier system was a gift from the elders of the Uzumaki clan as a tribute to the alliance formed between Konoha and Yuzu through the marriage of my grandparents when the two royal families joined together. The symbol of the spiral we wear on our backs is the clan symbol of the Uzumaki clan to honor the alliance formed at the foundation of Konohagakure no Sado. It has all been recorded and kept safe in the Senju history archives." She finished, and everyone was stunned that what they all believed all this time was wrong. "Wait, then why don't we know about all of this?" asked an angered Hiashi, and Tsunade smiled sadly. During the start of the Second Great Shinobi War, Yuzu was attacked and destroyed by a joint effort of Kiri, Kumo and Iwa due to the fear of the Uzumaki clan and their prowess in. They sent for help to Konoha, but we didn't have forces to spare, and until the time help reached, Yuzu was already in ruins. The whole village was wiped out. My grandfather and granduncle, feeling the shame at not being able to save their family, were so guilty that they removed all records of the clan to forget the shame that Konoha felt at the time. I know it since the Senju and Uzumaki were cousin clans tied through blood, and all records are kept in the Senju family archives." She finished, and all of them sat silent, taking in the information, as not even Danzo knew the truth that the Uzumaki and Senju were that closely related. "Hey, wasn't Naruto an Uzumaki? Was he related to the clan?" asked Shikaku as he remembered another Uzumaki before him. Kushina was her name if he remembered right, he thought, and Tsunade shook her head. His heritage was known only to the Sandaime, and he took it with him to the grave. Only Naruto himself knows of it because Sandaime left him a sealed wooden box telling him about it, which I handed over to him at the time of his banishment. It could just have been a way for the Sandaime to honor the once great clan or something else, we shall never know," she said sadly as the memories of him returned to her and her heart ached. She missed her idiotic blonde and his ever-present smile. Shikaku was remembering the tomboyish red-haired girl and remembered who she was always around with. His eyes widened suddenly, blonde hair, cerulean blue eyes, no one else had those exotic features. So that's why he chose him to seal the Kyuubi, he was his own son. Tsunade saw the expression of realization, shock and horror on his face and was curious as to what had Nara so worked up. "What's the matter, Shikaku, you have something to say?" she said, and Shikaku stared at her for a few moments before he sighed and shook his head. "No, Tsunade-sama just remembered something about my wife," he said as several clan heads snickered, and Tsunade knew he was lying through his teeth immediately. Shikaku knew that anything about it now was a waste of time. The boy was most probably dead by now, since there had been no news of him in the past 3 years, and the way of his banishment left very little chance for his survival. They had driven away the prince of the village with such royal blood without even realizing it. He decided to drop the moot point since it was too troublesome for now. "So Tsunade-sama, what are we going to do about it?" asked Hamura, and she looked at him confused. "What about what?" she asked curiously as the elders were shocked. "About Suna, of course, something must be done about them," said Kaharu, and she was even more curious now. "I'm sorry, I don't really follow you," said Tsunade, and now they were flabbergasted. "What do you mean they are getting too powerful? We must do something," said Danzo in outrage, and now Tsunade was enraged. "We will do nothing of the sort, they are the only major village which is completely neutral to Konoha, and the Kazukiage is coming in a few days to make the final negotiations of the alliance propositions with us that the Suna Council has been delaying for the past 2 years. Now that I know their strength and the alliances they hold, I want to make this work even more," she said calmly, and the whole council nodded as all of them except Tsunade were thinking of ways to get their hands on the power that Suna now held and to forge an alliance with them that was solid enough to last and get them something in return. "I have an idea for the alliance to work and last long, Tsunade-sama," said Danzo, and she grimaced inwardly, already knowing it to be something ugly which would make her throw a fit, though urged for him to go on. "Why not forge an alliance the same way your grandfather did with Yuzushi Agakure no Sato?" he asked, and she raised an eyebrow at that. "A political marriage?" she asked, and he nodded. "But for that to even be considered, both parties must have important figures of their village to be married. Who do you have in mind?" she asked, though she already had an idea who it would probably be from the leaf. Danzo smirked as he answered. "Why not propose a marriage between Sasuke Uchiha, the last Uchiha and Sharingan holder to the leaf, and Temari no Sabaku, the daughter of the 4th Kazukiage and the sister to the 5th. It should hold the alliance firm, and we benefit with a strong Kunoichi from the sand with royal blood, and she would be a perfect bride for Sasuke, as he too desires a strong and powerful wife to rebuild his clan," he said, and she nodded, though Mabuki Haruno was seething at the idea of someone other than her daughter marrying the last Uchiha and losing her chance at gaining respect in the village. "But why would they even consider sending her to our village? What do they gain in return?" she asked, and Danzo answered. "They get a strong alliance and the support of the leaf, the loyalty of the Uchiha clan, as well as the hand of the Uchiha heir in marriage. That should definitely be enough for them to be convinced, and we even say that she gets dual citizenship to both villages so that she could go back to her village anytime she pleases. And imagine if any of her children manage to get the power of the Jinten Kekkei Genkai that runs in the blood of her family, we might get the Kekkei Genkai that 3 of their Kazukiages are feared for. And that, coupled with the Sharingan, will make the Uchiha clan even stronger than before," he said, and the whole council agreed, seeing the advantages they would gain as well as that they might get. Tsunade scowled at the idea of breeding children, for though knew that it was a political matter and her own opinion didn't matter. "Alright, I'll talk to the Kazukiage on this matter along with the rest of the matters concerning the alliance, and we'll see what comes out of it," she said, though she inwardly wanted to castrate that cripple for even suggesting such a disgusting thing. "Alright then, is there anything else you wish to discuss?" she asked, and they shook their heads. "Then the council is dismissed," said Tsunade, and they all left. Tsunade walked into her office and plopped down in her chair and poured herself some sake. "Tsunade-sama, what do you think would happen with the Sand Village?" asked Shizune, as she knew why Tsunade was drinking sake at this time. The issue of Naruto that was picked up at the council was always a difficult thing for her. "I don't know, Shizune, I haven't met Gaara at all in the past few years. Their village was always sending a delegation in his place, and ever since Temari quit being the Konoha Suna official ambassador. The talks for the alliance have been pretty much at a stall, but with this meeting the issue will be made clear once and for all. Plus, the upcoming exams are being co-hosted by the Leaf and the Sand. The first 2 phases will be in the Leaf, with the third part being hosted by the Sand. This will give us the time to complete the talks," she said, and Shizune nodded as she went about to get the work of the office done. Tsunade wondered where her blonde little was, or if he was even alive. She had sent several Anbu over the years on his trail, but all had returned without a trace, saying he was now most probably dead or captured by some enemy village, and most probably had his beast extracted and his body experimented upon. She wasn't ready to believe that her Naruto could be dead, and a tear rolled down her eye at the guilt she felt at not being able to do anything for him. Hanahagakure no Sato. Barback Place. The Rookie 11 were gathered at the Barback Place along with their friends and were sitting there, but there was only one person missing from the group: Sasuke. Sasuke had gotten even more of a loner ever since he was brought back by Naruto and had his curse seal removed by Jiraiya even after many of his protests. Shikamaru was sitting there with a thoughtful expression on his face, and Ino decided to question it. "What's the matter with you, Shikamaru?" she asked, and he looked at her surprised, not even noticing that he had spaced out and sighed. "Nothing, just thinking about the delegation that is about to come from the sand. This year Leaf and Sand are co-hosting the exams with the first two parts here, while the third part is in the sand. Just wondering who will be in charge of it from their village," he said lazily, and she smirked. "Why do you want that Sand Princess Temari to be the one?" she asked in a slight tone, and he threw her a glare. It was a touching point for him, and everyone knew he liked her, though she hadn't responded to any of his advances at all, and that confused him to no end. "You know that she doesn't want anything to do with me, Ino. She made it pretty clear the last time we met a couple of years ago," he said somberly, and she nodded sadly, remembering how he was burnt off when he tried to ask her the reason for her rejection, and she had all but given him the cold shoulder. She decided to change the topic and turn to her friend Sakura, who was just quietly playing with her own food. "So Sakura, has Tsunade-sama agreed to take you on as an apprentice?" she asked, and Sakura frowned. "No, she has told me that she won't take any apprentice from the Leaf Village since she doesn't find anyone worthy enough in her eyes, and told me to continue working at the hospital on my own," she said, and Ino nodded. Everything she said was getting everyone in a bad mood. "Hey, have you heard about the broken alliance of the Wave and the Spring Villages?" asked Niji, and they all nodded as Sakura grimaced and put her spoon down as Hinata looked at her confused. "Sakura-chan, is something wrong?" she asked with her usual stutter, and Sakura looked down at her plate. "Yes, it is most probably due to Naruto," she said in a low voice, and everyone was saddened at the way they had treated him all those years ago. None of them other than Sasuke and Sakura had wanted the boy to get banishment for his mistakes. Everyone knew how much Sakura missed the blonde, especially after her last encounter with Sasuke. No one knew the details of what had happened, but Sakura had lost her crush and had been depressed about Naruto leaving and had regretted her words to him that she spoke at the time of his leaving. She missed the blonde and his cheerful attitude, as he always tried to cheer her up when she was down by asking her for a date and then would even take her lashing just to make her feel better. She despised her own fangirl attitude that she held all those years ago, and when she came off her high from Sasuke and her fantasy world, he was long gone and missing from her life. Hinata too missed the blonde and wished she had the courage to go against her father and at least meet him one last time before he had left to confess her feelings for the blonde. Everyone else too regretted their last words to the blonde boy and wanted him to come back, though knew there wasn't even a chance of that since he was most probably dead now. Sakura had asked Tsunade if she could go and find him, but had gotten a serious lashing being asked if she hadn't already done enough, and now she couldn't leave him in peace even after he was gone. She had cried and ran to her home and had kept herself locked up for 2 days before returning to duty. Shikamaru regretted his last words to his childhood friend and thought of how stupid he was to take out his frustration on him even though he brought Sasuke back. Sasuke had all but cut off from the group, saying they only tied him down and had a foul mouth and an even more arrogant attitude since the villagers treated him like a prince to keep him loyal to the village and had Kakashi now as his personal trainer. He had been promoted to himself, making him even more arrogant than before, as the council wished him to be as loyal as he could and give him the facilities he needed with the rank of Tsunade no Sato. It was a bright and usually hot day in the Sand Village as Temari walked through the village in her usual attire. She was wearing her purple battle kimono and dark purple skirt slit from both sides, showing her toned thighs, one of which had fishnet covering it with her other calf doing the same, and was wearing an Anbu armor over it with a scarlet sash on her waist, see story icon for reference. She was walking to the weapons shop to get her battle fan back from maintenance when she felt 2 arms wrap around her waist and a pair of lips on her neck as she moaned and melted into the loving embrace of the man she loved so much. "So where are you going home?" asked a husky voice nibbling her ear, and shivers ran down her spine as she turned around and gazed into those loving cerulean pools that she loved so much. She wrapped her arms around his neck and softly pressed her lips against his, not caring the least about the people watching her as she broke the gentle kiss off, rubbing his whiskers with her hand softly as he leaned into her hand, making her smile. Naruto stood there at 6 feet, taller than her by 4 inches, and a lean athletic build with his hair shadowing his eyes, giving him a mystifying look. He was wearing a light grey cut-sleeves shirt and a white full-sleeves jacket open in the front, with blue Anbu pants and fingerless gloves with metal back plates and matching sandals to go with them. He wore his beige hip pouch and white kunai holster in the usual way, and the Suna metal plate stitched on the jacket on his right arm under the Namikaze symbol and the Uzumaki swirl on the other arm. The most striking feature were the blue flames at the bottom of his jacket that accentuated his clothes. Temari traced her hands on his firm chest and put her head on it as he wrapped her up in his arms and she melted in the embrace and he disappeared in a water shunshin. He came back up to the top of the highest tower nearby and sat her down on his lap in the shade and she snuggled in his arms. "This me?" he asked softly, brushing her hair as he opened them of their bindings to let them flow freely and ran his fingers in them and she nodded, hugging him. "You were supposed to come back last night and here you are coming half a day late," she said in a mock-angry tone and he smiled and kissed the top of her head softly. "I'm sorry but there was a problem in the barrier and I had to go check it up. Some idiot tried to improve it but instead ruined the stability of the seals. As soon as I left I came to you without reporting the success to Gaara," he said softly, making her smile as she looked up and pecked him happily. "Well, you did the right thing, I have to go to Gaara too, so let's go together," she said and he smiled and nodded as he kissed her neck and pulled her kimono sideways, licking her collarbone that she was so sensitive to and she moaned softly, running her fingers through his hair. "Naru-kun," she moaned and he smiled and gave her a gentle kiss on her lips and fitted her kimono properly, smiling at the pretty pink blush she had on her face. She started to tie her hair again as he caught her wrist and she looked at him confused. "Let them flow in the wind, you look pretty that way," he said softly, tucking a lock of hair behind her ear, making her blush intensify as both stood up. He wrapped her up in a hug and both disappeared in a swirl of water, going to the Kazakage Tower after heading to the weapons shop and having some lunch at his house with his home and having some alone time. Kazakage Tower. Kazakage office. Gaara was going through the paperwork and was frustrated to no end. Ever since some idiot tried to show his sealing prowess with modifications to the sealing barrier and had disabled it. The council was in an uproar and every 10 minutes some official would come and ask him about it and it was now getting frustrating. He had sent Naruto to deal with it since he was the one who designed it from the ground up and he was supposed to report to him 2 hours ago, but there was no sign of him and he wasn't with the barrier team either and he was dealing with those idiot counselors and paperwork and was almost considering killing the whining fool in front of him with his sand. "I'll send a message as soon as Naruto is done with the barrier repairs," he said, calmly hiding his frustrations, and the man smiled and left after thanking him and another knock came to the door and his eye twitched. If it was another man who was here to whine about the barrier who had nothing to do with the damn thing, then there would be blood. "Come in," he said stoically, and in walked Naruto and Temari as he saw his sister's hair opened and flowing and her lips were a bit swollen, and turned to Naruto, who apparently had some pink lipstick on his neck that he hadn't noticed but put it aside, knowing what the two had been up to. "Uzumaki, you were supposed to report to me 2 hours ago after you left the barrier team. I have sent 3 Anbu teams for you, but there has been no news." He was cut off as the Anbu teams appeared in the office and bowed to him. "Kazakage-sama, looks like Naruto Uzumaki has left the village, we couldn't find him anywhere," the leader said, and his eyes twitched as he pointed to the man standing in front of him who had an amused smile on his face while Temari was giggling. The Anbu smartly vanished the office as sand had appeared where they were a moment ago and he turned to Naruto, who still had that infuriating smile on his face that made him restless. "Where were you, Uzumaki? I have been answering those damn council fools about it for the past 2 hours, who apparently had nothing to do with this matter, and you have apparently left the barrier team on time but are coming 2 hours late. So I ask again, where were you?" he asked annoyedly, and Naruto put his finger on his chin in a thinking pose. "Well, let's see, I was coming to you when I met him and we caught up with each other since I had not been able to meet her last night," he said, calmly pointing to Temari, making his eyes twitch. "Then we went to get her fan from the weapons shop, then we got hungry and I made us some lunch and we ate, and then, well, we had some alone time." He finished, making Temari blush as she traced her finger on her lip, thinking of the makeout session they had. Gaara's eye was twitching dangerously as he listened to his lame excuses for coming this late for a report. "So you were doing all those things while you had to make an important report to me, am I right?" he asked, and Naruto nodded. "You do know that reporting to the cage of the village after a mission is mandatory?" he asked sarcastically, making Naruto smile. "So I've heard." He nonchalantly made Gaara's fingers twitch and he had to control the urge to punch him with a sand fist but knew he would never catch him in time and he sighed, pinching his nose in frustration as Temari giggled. "Uzumaki, I swear you'll be the death of me someday, so I assume the problem was fixed?" he asked hopefully, and Naruto nodded with a smile, making him sigh in relief as he turned to Temari for the important matter he had to discuss with her. "Temari, I'm sorry but there is a mission of negotiation I have that you won't like," he said, and she looked at him confused. "You will be coming with me to Konoha for the final negotiations on our peace treaty. You are the best negotiator we have and your knowledge in politics is unparalleled as shown in the previous 2 alliances." he said, and her eyes widened as she turned furious and was about to retort when Naruto put a hand on her shoulder and gave her a smile and shook his head. Don't let your personal feelings come in between. What's in the past is done, plus it is only a one-time deal, right? He asked Gaara, who didn't answer, making him raise an eyebrow, and Temari's anger rose. Well, she has also been appointed as the liaison between Suna and Konoha for the upcoming joint exams. He said, and she looked at him incredulously. You can't be serious. She shouted, and he nodded, showing his firm resolve. It is the order of the council and your cage, you cannot refuse this mission. He said, and her eyes widened as she stormed off the office, slamming the door behind her, making him wince, knowing he would pay for playing the rank card later, and turned to Naruto, who was looking at him with confusion. Gaara, you shouldn't have forced her like that, so we could have convinced her peacefully. He said, and Gaara shook his head. No, it was the only way. Anyway, I wanted to take you as my personal bodyguard, but we couldn't let you come to Konoha, and at least one of us must stay in the village, as we don't want it to appear too weak, though I trust you with my life the most, my friend. So I'll be taking Kankuro instead, and I hand over my military powers to you, while the diplomatic powers are handed to the council. The whole council has agreed to my decision as well. He said, and Naruto's eyes widened. To give him military control of a shinobi village was essentially naming him a temporary cage, and the whole council trusted him enough. Gaara saw his face and smiled a bit as he stood up and put a hand on his shoulder. Uzumaki, we both know you have always been the stronger of the two of us, and you have gained a lot of influence and respect in the council over the years with your contributions to the village by giving us your clan seals and helping us forge alliances, and your loyalty to me still remains unquestionable. Let's see how you do as a temporary Kazekage in my absence. I couldn't find a better person to hand the power of the village in my absence. You are my right hand and my brother in all but blood. He said. Naruto was stunned at the trust and acceptance the village and Gaara showed him and couldn't find the words for the situation that had arisen now. He couldn't comprehend the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, and his mind was spinning. Gaara squeezed his shoulder, making him look at him, and gave him a curt nod. Don't worry, Uzumaki, you are only in charge of the shinobi, and the rest of the affairs will be handled by the council. It is only for a few days, I know you'll do fine. You have never disappointed me, and I know you won't this time too. Now go and check on Temari, I am worried about her. He said, and Naruto nodded immediately, forgetting all about the situation as his thoughts turned to his love, and he rushed out of the office to find his home. He forgets all about the pressure of being a temporary cage because Temari is troubled. That idiot never ceases to amaze me. He thought, returning to the bane of his life, paperwork. Naruto got out of the Kazekage tower and started searching for Temari. He looked everywhere from the Sabaku estate to all the spots she hung out at and was now getting worried. He frantically searched for her everywhere as the sun was going down, and now his heart was racing fast, thinking something might have happened to her. He rocked his brain for where she might have gone off to when his brain suddenly clicked and he rushed to the cave where he took her for his first date and rushed there. He entered the cave and started looking around as he saw her there sleeping, leaning against a tree with Kiara sleeping beside her, and sighed in relief. He slowly walked up as Kiara heard footsteps and opened her eyes to see her summoner, and he put his finger to his lips, telling her to stay quiet, and sat beside his princess. He gently put his hand beside her head and put it on his lap as she wrapped her arms around his waist and snuggled in his stomach in her sleep, making him smile. He saw the tear marks across her cheek and knew she had been crying as he ran his fingers through her hair and gently laid a kiss on top of her head, and she smiled in her sleep and snuggled further. He kept rubbing her head for an hour as her eyes fluttered open, and she saw that she was sleeping on something very comfortable and warm and knew what it was as she tried to get away by sitting up, but Naruto pulled her to his lap and gripped her tightly, burying his face in her neck as she struggled. In his grip. Let me go. She said angrily, and he kissed her neck softly, making her struggle a bit less, and started laying kisses and licking her sensitive skin softly as her struggles ceased, and she tilted her head sideways and pulled his head closer by his hair. Let me go, Naru-kun. She moaned and tried to resist half-heartedly, and he smirked, pulling her kimono sideways and biting her collarbone, gently drawing a bit of blood as she gasped. Naru-kun. She moaned in pleasure as he softly licked the mark clean of the bit of blood and laid soft kisses up her neck, going to her ear as she pulled his head closer, letting him have the access he needed, and he gently kissed and licked her ear, nibbling it softly, getting another soft moan from her beautiful pink lips. I'm sorry. He whispered and buried his face in her neck, taking in the scent of her hair, and she smiled as he took her anger away and ran her fingers through his hair and closed her eyes as he held her tightly close to him. If you didn't agree with me, at least don't agree with him. She whispered softly, and he nodded and softly kissed her neck, making her smile. I know him, but it was an order from the council, you would have had to do it either way, so I tried to convince you. I wasn't going against you. He said softly, and she smiled and nodded. I know I just got angry thinking of that stupid village and needed to vent my frustrations. She said, and he nodded as she saw the state his clothes were in since she left him and was confused as to why they were in such bad shape. Why are your clothes that way, Naru-kun? She asked, and he sighed tiredly in her neck. I was worried sick about you. He said with a sigh, and she was confused as he continued. You ran away angry and I knew you were about to cry and that was why you ran away. I searched the village top to bottom for 2 hours and still didn't find you. I was scared something had happened to you. He whispered and tightened his hold on her, making her gasp at her stupidity. This was the last place left and if you weren't here I would have torn this village apart top to bottom to find you. He whispered as she felt a tear on her neck and knew she shouldn't have run away like that. Don't run away like that again. He whispered, kissing her neck, and she nodded. I'm sorry, I was just too. She said, but was cut off as he pressed his lips on hers in a gentle kiss and gave her a smile. I know. He said softly, putting a lock of hair behind her ear, and she smiled and nodded as he suddenly lifted her hand and kissed the back of it and looked at her curiously. Do you love me? He asked, and she was confused at the sudden question but answered nonetheless. More than you could ever know. She whispered softly, rubbing his cheek as he leaned into her touch, making her smile. Do you trust me? He asked, and she answered wholeheartedly. More than I trust myself. She whispered softly, and a small smile lit up his face. Will you be with me? He asked, and she smiled. I'm already yours, my ball of sunshine. She whispered, and he smiled, genuinely happy, and suddenly slid a platinum ring in the shape of a 9-tailed fox with a red ruby in its eye in the third finger in her left hand, and she gasped as she looked at him with tears in her eyes as he gazed at her. Lovingly. Then marry me. He whispered, and she threw herself in his arms as he caught her in his arms and she cried in his chest. He smiled softly and rubbed her back gently, trying to soothe the hysterically crying girl. And here I thought you would be happy for getting the ring. He said playfully, and she giggled as she hit his chest lightly and grabbed his collar of the jacket and smiled. Baka, shut up and kiss me. She said and pulled him to her as she captured his lips and pushed her lips to his with all her might. She licked his bottom lip softly and he opened his mouth and she pushed her tongue in, exploring his caverns completely, and Naruto saw that she was trying to show what she felt and let her do what she wanted and gently massaged her tongue with his own, and she moaned in the kiss as she put her hand on the back of his neck and pulled him close to her, deepening the kiss. Naruto's eyes glazed as he had never felt her kiss him so passionately before, and as she broke off he saw her tongue a bit red with blood and trace his finger on his lip, seeing she had bitten him slightly, and saw her panting. Gazing at him lovingly. She dove on again. This time she caught his bottom bleeding lip in her own and sucked on it softly, making him groan in pleasure as she broke off after a couple of minutes as he brought her close and put her head on his chest and his chin on her head, running his fingers in her hair as she sighed happily. Do you think I proposed a bit early? He asked nervously after a few minutes of happy silence, and she looked at him with an amused smile as she wrapped her arms around his neck, and their faces were inches off as he tried to lean in, but she would lean back equally, making him growl as she giggled. Well, that's a really interesting question after proposing to me, you know. She said playfully, and he blushed in embarrassment as she giggled. Why did you ask? Are you having any doubts? She asked, knowing that wasn't the reason and knew why he was asking it, but wanted to hear it from him. No, it isn't that, but you know, Kankuro told me that in a relationship first the couple, you know. He trailed off, blushing, and she giggled at his shyness. Have sex? She asked playfully, and he blushed and stuttered a hi, making her giggle. Well, when have we been a normal couple? You had an extreme makeout session and gave me the best first kiss a girl could ever ask for and asked me to be your girlfriend before you took me to my first date. That was equally as romantic as I could hope for, where I told you that I wanted to have a family and spend my life with you. So I guess 3 years of dating and proposing without having sex is not that unusual, and sex isn't the only thing in a relationship, love. Our bond is the strongest thing we need, she said softly, and he nodded, seeing her point as she continued. And we could, you know, have sex if you want. I have already told you I let you have me anytime you want. So want to do it now? She asked playfully and giggled as he turned bright red and pecked him, rubbing his whiskers softly. You are too innocent for your own good, Naru-kun, and way too easy to tease. She said, giggling, and he smiled as he kissed her lips softly and sensually laid kisses on her jawline and the sensitive areas of her neck and nibbled her ears softly, earning a soft moan from her. Still think I'm too innocent? He asked huskily, and shivers ran down her spine as he pinned her to the ground with one of his knee on her thigh to raise it up and his hands holding her wrists as he looked at her disheveled hair and kimono and the way her fishnets were giving a view of her drenched panties. He lowered his head to her ear and whispered. You're already this wet, Mary-chan, you really are a naughty lily of the desert, aren't you? He whispered, and she moaned as he kissed her ear softly and rose up, gazing at her vulnerable position lovingly, and she wriggled her wrists, knowing he won't go any further as he let her go, and she brought him In a hug and held him tightly as she cried and he was worried. "What happened, Haim, did I hurt you?" He asked and she cried harder as he turned her around, so she laid on his chest and hugged her tightly, rubbing her back gently. "Shh, what's wrong?" He whispered softly as she looked at him, sobbing. "I know you only hold back because of that thing I told you 1 year ago, don't you?" She asked in a sob, and he smiled as his mind went to that night of the festival in the village. Flashback. Naruto and Temari were sitting on the roof of the Sabaku estate as they had just returned from the annual festival in the village and were sitting there cuddling in their traditional kimonos looking at the fireworks. "Naru-kun?" She whispered and he looked at her, kissing her head softly. "Yes," he asked, and she looked at the fireworks as she spoke. "You know, I always had a dream that I haven't told anyone." She whispered and he looked at her curiously. "What is that, Haim?" He asked softly as he put her head on his chest and sat her on his lap as they sat in the shower of fireworks. "I've always wanted to get married to a man that would love me as my brothers would give me away to the love of my life, and we will have that special night that I have waited for on our honeymoon." She whispered and he smiled as he imagined her dream with him being the groom. "That's a beautiful dream, home." He whispered softly and she nodded as he kissed her on her lips, cupping her face as the last of the fireworks went off and they got lost in the moment. End of flashback. He cupped her face, kissing her tears away, and smiled at the lovely crying girl. "Look at me, love." He whispered and she caught his loving gaze that made her heart warm and she smiled a bit, still sobbing. "You know that I love you, right?" He asked and she nodded as he rubbed her nose with the sleeve of his jacket, making her giggle. "Do you know why I gave you that ring tonight instead of a special date I had planned?" He asked and she shook her head and was surprised that he had a special date planned for her, but it was just like her cute baka to do something like that. "This ring," he said, kissing her finger and the ring as he looked at her. "That is a promise," he said and she tilted her head to the side cutely and he smiled as he pecked her lips. "That ring contains my Horatian marker, the fastest and the most sophisticated one I have ever created. It took me a year to finish engraving such a complex seal in such a small ring. Just channel a bit of your chakra in it and I'll be there in a flash to get you. It also acts as a beacon due to the little demonic chakra I have put in the diamond, thus it is turned into a blood red color and lets me know where you are at all times so that you don't run off on me again, and it has blood seals so no one can remove it from you other than me or you and force you to remove it if you are in trouble. As long as you have that ring, I'm always with you. That ring is the pinnacle that I have achieved with my sealing. My masterpiece that I created for myself. No one has ever come close to putting so many complex seals and synchronizing them perfectly in such a small object before. As long as that ring is with you, we are one," he said softly, and her eyes widened as she pulled out the ring and gazed at the seals engraved so finely and lightly that they weren't visible if she didn't look closely, and saw what the ring meant to him. It wasn't a piece of expensive jewelry, it was a promise as to how much he loved her. He put his hand on the ring and slid it back as he cupped her cheek and brushed it softly. "Sex doesn't matter to me, Haim. I'll die a virgin if it means having you in my arms," he whispered and she threw herself in his arms and cried, whispering "I love you" again and again. He sat up and channeled a bit of chakra to his palm as a bit of moisture from the air came to his hand, making it wet, and he wiped her face and cleaned it away of her tear stains, and she pouted like a child, making him smile. "Let's go home and I'll make you dinner, alright?" he asked and she nodded as she walked a couple of steps when he suddenly swept her legs and caught her in his arms, making her squeal in glee as she wrapped her arms around his neck and snuggled in his chest. "I never said you'll be walking home," he said playfully, and she giggled. "You spoil me too much," she said playfully, and he smiled as he pecked her softly. "My princess deserves the best," he said, and she giggled. "Charmer, don't use flattery, I'm already your fiancé now," she said, and he chuckled. "Hey, fiancé does have a sexy feel to it, you know," he said, and she laughed, hitting him in the chest as he jumped up on a branch. "Wife has a much sexier feel, you know," she whispered softly, and he nodded as he kissed her forehead gently. "It does, Haim, and you'll be called that soon if I have anything to say about it," he said softly, and she smiled and nodded as he jumped through the roof with her in his arms at blinding speeds, and she squealed happily as the air hit the both of them, and they laughed happily as the people saw the blonde blurs and smiled, knowing the happiest and most mischievous as well as popular couple in the village. The whole village knew the story of an unknown ninja who came to the village, becoming the right hand of the Kazekage and stealing the heart of the princess of the village and melting the ice princess's heart to only him.